Okay, so you've looked at a lot of this by yourself, so I'm just going to sort of go through a few things that you need to add. I'm quite happy that you've looked at a lot of this by yourself because it's something that you need to sort of get used to. You need to sort of get used to talking about things independently. So we've got the issue here of, you know, I'm not a child. So remembering, so we're starting from page 38, remembering that Sheila has to tell people she's not a child. She has to remind them. And Sheila talks with sharp sarcasm, saying, of course not. You were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it, Gerald. Now, what I want us to do is talk about that idea of the fairy prince, because what I think it does is I think it reflects this need for men to be heroes. And almost like his ego, so E-G-O, if you don't know what that means, please look it up. But Gerald has a really big ego where he thinks he's the hero, and he thinks that what he's doing is right. And what Sheila's really pointing out here is that in 1912, men were incredibly sexist. In a way that they thought women were there to sort of worship them. And that's really, really interesting because, you know, Gerald does let Daisy sort of worship him and then he gets rid of her. So again, it's not saying men are good, but it's saying that men need someone to stroke their ego. He actually says, all right, I did for a time nearly any man would have done. And this is really Priestley's way of actually saying that men at the time did use women to make themselves feel better. That's what they were doing. And Sheila actually says, you know, that's probably about the best thing you've said tonight. At least it's honest. And I think that's really interesting as well. So Sheila is praising him when he's honest. So it shows us that that's what Sheila really, really values. And there are a few things as well. Make sure you pause this and read this part as well. I know you've studied it yourself, but familiarise yourself with it, revise it. Mrs. Burling actually says, I don't think we want any further details of this disgusting affair. But Sheila says, cutting in, I do. So again, look how her mother tries to make the decision for Sheila. And Mrs. Burling just doesn't really want to know about it. But Sheila's actually saying, no, mother, like, as women, we can't sit here and be oblivious. We need to know these things. Mrs. Burling really just wants to ignore it. And he does that. Gerald actually has to say, you know, it's not disgusting. But Mrs. Burling says, it's disgusting to me. Now, there are ways we could say that, you know, women at the time didn't really want to talk about sex and things like that. But we could also say, you know, the fact that she was a lower class woman could be what disgusts Mrs. Burling. And I think that makes more sense later when we think about what Mrs. Burling did. Make sure you're making your notes here. But Sheila's, again, very, very sarcastic. Yes, but after all, you didn't come into this, did you, mother? And the inspector asks when it ended. But he also says that basically when he went away on business, he broke it off. And she took it very, very well. Now, Sheila then says with irony, that was nice for you. Meaning that actually, you know, men want to easily get out of relationships with women. Men want to use them for as long as they need to, and then they don't want their lives to be complicated when they get rid of them. So again, Priestley's really, really criticising men at this point in time as well. You know, no, it wasn't. She told me she'd been happier than she'd ever been before and that she knew it couldn't last. Hadn't expected it to last. She didn't blame me at all. I wish to God she had now. Now, yes, she's probably not blaming Gerald, but I think the reason she didn't blame Gerald is because she knows it's class. She knows it's a class system. Gerald can't be with her. He has to marry Sheila because they are of the same class. And so it's almost like Daisy Renton, Eva Smith, has just kind of resigned herself to a life of unhappiness because she's lower class. And that's quite sad. Now, this is something I really want to look at. Gerald then talks about her saving money. She'd saved a little money during the summer. She'd lived very economically on what I'd allowed her. Right, so economically means that she's lived very well. So he uses that adverb, economically, to actually show that Eva/Daisy was very, very good with money. But do you remember at the beginning when he says all lower class factory working women would be broke if I know them? He doesn't say it quite like that. He says, you know, they'd all be broke if I know them. But he's talking about lower class factory workers, and that's what Eva/Daisy was. So Gerald can put them all into a group with massive prejudice and actually say, you know, they're all really bad with money. But then when it comes to one that he knows, he actually starts to realised that not all lower class women were bad with money. But at the beginning, he blamed them. So actually have a look at how ignorant Gerald is. So in one way, Gerald's sticking up for her, but he insulted her when he didn't know it was her before. So actually what Gerald's showing us here is that the upper class can see that the lower classes are poor, not because they're bad with money, but actually just because they are just poor. But he chooses not to see it. He picks and chooses when he is prejudiced and when he's not. And that's again showing that Gerald is quite a flawed character, even though he seems like he's the nicest to her. And then they talk about her going off to the seaside and keeping a sort of diary. The inspector actually says something quite sad. She felt there'd never be anything as good again for her. Which is, again, sort of showing the hopelessness of the lower classes. They don't have hope. And Gerald actually says, I'm quite upset and I need to go. Now, that's really interesting here because Gerald's showing a bit of conscience. And I want you to make sure you've made a note of that. He's showing that he feels bad. He has a conscience. Gerald says he's going to walk about for a while and then he'll come back. And what Sheila does just before he goes out is Sheila actually gives him the ring. Now, what this is symbolic of becomes clear later, and it is symbolism. So when she gives him the ring, that's what the technique is, because it's meant to show something really important about Sheila's character. She says here, I don't dislike you as I did half an hour ago, Gerald. In fact, in some odd way, I rather respect you more than I've done before. I knew anyhow you were lying about those months last year when you had hardly come near me. So she knew. But then she says, I knew there was something fishy about that time, and now at least you've been honest. And I believe what you told us about the way you helped her at first, just out of pity. And it was my fault, really, that she was so desperate when you first met her. So look at how Sheila takes responsibility. But this has made a difference, and you and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner here. We'd have to start all over again, getting to know each other. Burling tries to change her mind. Now, Sheila, I'm not defending him, but you must understand that a lot of young men, basically what he's saying here is, you know, young men can cheat on young women. It happens all the time. And Sheila actually says, you know, don't interfere, please, father. Look at that imperative language, don't interfere. She's no longer talking to him like, oh, Dad, can I do this? Like, she's now saying, no, don't do this. I don't want your input. Gerald knows what I mean, and apparently you don't. And Gerald actually says, yes, I know what you mean. Now, what she's saying here is that she's not the same person. And in one way, giving back the ring is symbolic, because when a woman got a wedding ring at that time, she became the property of the man. And these are all things you want to write down. She became the property of the man. She was no longer the property of her father. She became the property of her husband. Now, when she gives back that ring, actually what she's showing is that she is now an independent woman. And as an independent woman, she is not going to marry someone that's not treated her well. So this symbolism, this symbolizes Sheila changing for the better, Sheila becoming a more independent woman. And we see that because not only does she give the ring back to her potential husband and says she won't be his property, but she also uses imperative language. Remember, imperative language is like an instruction to say don't interfere. She talks to her father like she's the one in charge. And Gerald acknowledges that Sheila has changed. Gerald acknowledges that they've all changed. And I think that's really interesting, and we'll come back to why that's interesting. And so just keep that in mind, but we'll come back to why that's interesting a little bit later on in the play. And Mrs. Burling says, I think we've just about come to the end of this wretched business. And Gerald says, I don't think so. So again, Mrs. Burling's like, no, I'm in charge now, so I'm going to tell you this is the end of it. And Gerald's like, no, it's not. So I'm going to stop there, and this is quite a short video, but I think that this is a really, really important part of the play to sort of analyse and go over. And it's really important that we start looking at how Sheila is changing and whether we think that Gerald is a horrible person, because you can see that what he did, you know, he did because he cared about her, but does he become a bit of a hypocrite because he treated her fine, but that was just because she was pretty? So is he a good person, or does he just use people? Does he exploit people for what he can get out of them? In that case, is he any better than Mr. Burling? Because that's what Mr. Burling does. You know, he doesn't pay his workers properly. He just exploits them until he's got what he wants from them, and then he fires them. So is Gerald much the same? And this is what we've got to question, whether Gerald is actually the best person out of all of them, or whether he's actually someone who's very, very problematic, almost the same as Mr. Burling. Okay, so keep that in mind. Make sure you've made all the notes, and then get on to the classwork.